Okay, when I was preparing this presentation, it was sort of like a walk through my career in terms of, I guess, sort of some of the genesis of how we got to where we are. And I'm not entirely responsible for the clearing regulations, but I can explain them. Okay, so I'm going to, I just need to get this over here so I can actually see what I'm looking at. Yeah, wrong one, I'm a Mac user.
You have to use a little do as you change, it won't change from there.
I'll just have to make it up as I go along. There we go. So I've got it. Right, so overview. Biodiversity and native vegetation in WA. We had a little bit of a chat about where we've been, where we're at and where we're going to. The genesis of the clearing provisions in the Environmental Protection Act. The principles and the workings. I'm not going to go into the details of every one of the regulations. I'm sure some of you probably want me to. And then a little bit of the role of practitioners. And this tic-tacs quite well with Declan's previous talk. It's locked up. She's touched it. So, protection of biodiversity in WA. We know that it's a biologically diverse state, that we have it's unique vegetation, fauna on a world scale, high species richness, we have high threats and various impacts. We are a resource development state. And we have policies and guidelines. We've always had policies and guidelines in terms of conserving, but I think the talks up until now have talked about perhaps some of the failings in that, but we haven't gone into that, but certainly indicating some of the failings in our policies and guidelines. And Malcolm mentioned that when you do science, it's the same as legislation. When it's wrong, it needs improvement, you learn from it and you improve it. And that's the situation of how we ended up with the clearing regulations. Not the regulations with a capital R, but regulating of clearing in Western Australia. We tend to talk about the regulations of clearing as if that's the whole box and dice, and it's a little bit like impact assessment versus approvals. So the whole point of the amendments to the EP Act were to regulate clearing. Everybody, if you watch the weather, any time of the day of the week, you'll be familiar with this image, but it is extremely telling in that southwest corner in terms of the amount of clearing that had occurred and was continuing, and is continuing to occur. It wasn't the only focus of the clearing provisions in the EP Act, but certainly it is part of the impetus behind it. So we've had since 1900s a rolling situation of incentives to clear. There's been tax concessions, there's been drought relief, rural adjustment, various subsidies. We've had land degradation as a result of definitely ill-planned clearing. And we've had incentives to conserve. And we've then recognised that everyone talks about the carrot and stick, that the incentives to conserve just weren't doing the job. So hence the introduction of legislative controls, because we ended up with a situation that, despite the way I have seen it reported in some places, being a biodiversity hotspot is not a good thing. It's actually a result of high biodiversity, high species richness and high threats. So it really wasn't a great thing for us to be listed as one of the 25 global biodiversity hotspots. So I thought we'd go back a little bit to 1898. That's not the whole term of my career. It might be Malcolm's, but it's not the whole term of my career. But it is the first published paper on the fact that salinity was caused by clearing of vegetation. It's by the state engineer, Mr. Smith, in 1898. And it took us quite a long time to get our head around that and actually do something about it. So from 1918 was when CSIRO was created, and they did a lot of good science that helped develop marginal lands, that helped address cropping issues, that helped us become an agricultural economy. But it also meant that between 1945 and 1982, that there was an incredible amount of clearing. So we had incentives to clear. They're too numerous to list, but there's a lot of them. And developments in agricultural science, as I mentioned. We also had, between the 1960s and 1980s, 1 million acres a year. There was a great documentary on that if anybody wants to be depressed Friday night with a glass of gin. It's the reality. It was a conditional purchase, and there was a massive drive for clearing. In fact, even into the 80s, the conditional purchase conditions on people buying land that they had to clear and maintain it was cleared still existed. So sometimes we end up with a little bit of contradiction in our legislation. So we also had the minerals boom that started in the 60s, which continues up and down, as we all know, working in consultancy. We also had we had a number of issues. So this gets a little bit faster. I'm not going to drag on for 120 years from 1898. But we had a number of recognitions that there was land degradation. There were controls introduced in the 60s for protection of water catchment, which actually really came into effect in 1976 and are still in effect in a number of clear and controlled catchments. We ended up with land care as a result of the land degradation. We had a decade of land care, which apparently is still being assessed years after its decade of land care. And we started to have various aspects of environmental assessments happening at a statewide level, at a national level. We had incentives to conserve as a result of the incentives to clear. This is society. We had NHT, we had funding, we had various programs, we had covenanting programs, we had bush brokers. We continue to clear. We had the State Salinity Council, 1996, and nearly 100 years after that first recognition, there was funding and resourcing to do something about the economic losses, mostly within the southwest of WA. And we continued with a number of legislative controls as well as incentives. And we get ourselves all the way to clearing provisions. There was actually, it was great having Declan earlier, there was a report by EDO in 1998, I think it was, looking at the increase in clearing. There was an MOU that investigated whether Section 38 of the Soil and Land Conservation Act could be used to protect biodiversity, which was a joint MOU with, what do they call that, CALM? CALM? Can't keep up with the name changes. CALM, EPA, and clearing was managed at that time through notices of intent under the Soil and Land Conservation Act and notices of intent for mining. And the biodiversity issues really weren't addressed. And all the State of Environment reports and all the other reports were recognising that it was a massive loss. I mean, there's just so many papers that you could go through. So we ended up with 2002, the EP Amendment Act to introduce regulation of clearing. And similar to what Ken will talk about, the provisions for clearing couldn't be brought into effect until there were regulations. And that was my job. Well, and my team. So that ended up in 2004. So let's have a little bit more of a detailed look at the legislative framework. So it was based on the South Australian legislation. So if you don't like people in South Australia, you can blame them. It was inserted under Part 5 of the Environmental Protection Act, as Declan mentioned previously. And it replaced that notice of intent to clear process that had been cobbled together, that was challenged by a number of farming representatives, farming cases and farming groups, and some of those inquiries that were up on the previous page. Proclaimed in July 2004, and I won't go into the details, but it's now subject to the bilateral agreement. So the elements will include exemptions, permits, assessment and offsets, transparency, which is a little bit variable lately. We've got an appeals process, which was mentioned is straight through the Minister for the Environment. Conservation notices for when there's been clearing that's been illegal, it needs to be replaced. Penalties and delegations, and specifically the delegation to demurs. There is an interaction between the EP Act Part 4 and Part 5, and you will see that there are times when if you've made a referral for a formal assessment and it will come back, there was a little glitch, there was a little gap that was recognised when the regulations were brought into effect and the clearing provisions became enacted, that it meant that you'd have to go through 2 rounds and that the Minister could essentially make 2 different decisions on the same proposal. That was subsequently fixed. So now it can be the case that it could be no formal assessment and clearing permit required. There was a little bit of a glitch there for a while. So the legislative framework. The definition for clearing is quite broad, and I don't think you're going to get prosecuted for a little bit of pruning, but it is important to understand, and people often don't understand, that it is an extensive definition, and there are good reasons for that. Certainly burning. So if you're burning, like a lot of people like to burn, graze, and you're passively cleared. So the definition captures that sort of Machiavellian thinking. So same thing, the definition for native vegetation is quite broad. It does include aquatic vegetation, which is important, and the fact that it is all living or dead vegetation, because we know that dead vegetation is habitat. Not to mention that even when it's dead, it's still got some soil conservation benefits. So there are exceptions to the rule, and this is how this legislation works. It's a prohibitive act, which means you can't clear anything without exemptions, and it's the same with some of these definitions. So if you think of it logically like that, it's the same thing. There is a definition for native vegetation, but then there are exceptions to that definition. So as I said, it's a prohibitive act, and clearing is allowed where there is an exemption or a permit has been granted. And here's some of the reasons why we don't clear. Pretty things. Okay, exemptions. 2 classes of exemptions. And this is really important because a lot of people do forget that there is Schedule 6. So Schedule 6 is in the Act, and it also means that if you're clearing under Schedule 6, that the environmentally sensitive areas that we'll touch on don't apply. And then there's the clearing for prescribed purposes, which is the regulations. So as I said, except in environmentally sensitive areas, which haven't changed since they were proclaimed. Okay, so Schedule 6, there's 14 clauses. This is just a couple, and a couple of examples. So probably the main one is Clause 1, which is clearing that is done in order to give effect to the requirement in another law. So it's where it's written in another law. And it's very specific. So energy operators, NBN, for example, telecommunications, There's a number of other clauses there. Fire is one that's controversial. Okay, so exemptions under regulations. So I was going to say, before Hayden, there of the basketball tickets, said to me that it's a complex act. I was going to say it was simple, in the sense that you need to read it, and you don't need to be a lawyer to read it, but you do need to actually follow the instructions, which are, there are prescriptions about what can be cleared, and then who can do it. Except if it's an ESA, and where there are the schedules for low impact mineral exploration, there are permitted areas and non-permitted areas. So it is complicated in that sense, but you can work your way through it. It's not so easy for the average farmer on the ground, and I certainly understand that. Okay, so environmentally sensitive areas, there was a list prepared, there was consultation, and they were declared by the Minister, and as I said, I don't believe they've been changed. They could certainly be added to. And the definition was that it had to be something that was publicly available, and so that's the limitation. So if you look at the ESAs and you think, gosh, I can think of things that should be on there that aren't, or this doesn't make any sense, it really was something that was publicly available. And there is the GIS map that's available for that, but I don't know about anybody else, but it certainly can be difficult to work with. Okay, clearing permits. Two types of clearing permits: area permits and purpose permits. And the key to this is who can actually apply for one of those permits. So if you've got an exploration licence, you can't apply for an area permit because you're not by definition an owner. And I have noticed, while this says that in the legislation it dictates 2 years or 5 years for a purpose permit unless otherwise specified, and I have seen purpose permits for 10 years recently. So assessment, as Declan touched on, there are the 10 principles that need to be given regard to, and this is where we need to understand what the purpose of your impact assessment is going to be, what's the purpose of your survey. So in this case, there are a number of guides, and some of them are old, they've got different names on them, DOE, DWER, but there are a number of guides that are still there on the internet that you can find, and it's worthwhile going through those and understanding them. One of my key bugbears is that rare flora is defined, so priority flora doesn't come under that principle, it actually comes under principle A. So there's processes and there's guidance, you need to understand the exemptions, you need to understand the offsets process, and there are guides for all of those, and the bilaterals. Because my screen's not showing it. And I guess, to me, it is a process. You can talk to a lawyer, you can talk to someone who understands how the regulations work, but understanding the exemptions when you're liaising with clients, or if you're a proponent that's in this room, we've got a great mixture, is actually understanding what you can do. I have seen people say, oh, I could add this exemption and that exemption and this exemption, and then I don't need to get a clearing permit. I think if you look at some other aspects of the EP Act, you'll find that that sort of thing is readily not accepted. And it's certainly not something I would promote. Another thing to look at is the conditions and the reporting requirements. So if you're providing advice to proponents and to clients, is to understand that we talked before about timing of surveys, and this has been a glitch, this whole idea of the fact that clearing permits should be a quick thing. People push the fact that, oh, we can do them in 60 to 90 days. But the issue is that, once again, it's about planning. And if you need to do your survey at a particular time of year, then your permit is going to take a lot longer. And one of the outs for that has been recently to issue permits with a condition to survey for species. And I will go on, I actually think that's one of the weaknesses in the process, which is really a result of political pressure. So this, you're not supposed to be able to read this, so don't worry about that. Is that there have been a number of changes. So there's been inquiries, there's been commissions, and there's been a number of changes to the regulations, and things that were maximum 5 hectare clearing limits are now 20 hectares. So the latest one in this compilation table is at the back of the 2013 regulations, actually shows all of these changes that have happened in the past. So you need to keep up with where things are at. So, protection or loss? So, effectiveness. I would recommend, it's 2008, but I would recommend reading the Auditor General's report. Some of the criticism, comments on that, and I know various people around the room would agree with this, was that it is a process for regulating clearing, assessing clearing, but there were very few refusals for issuing permits. And when there were appeals, quite often the appeals were dismissed or minor changes made to the outcomes. So one of the weaknesses that's been recognised is the numerous regulations. Unfortunately, that's the structure of how the Act works, but it also means that they are readily amended. The recent departmental changes, it really was a controversial piece of legislation, and I remember somebody saying at the time that if no one was happy, so there was certainly a lot of agitation from Pastoral and Graziers Association, and conservation groups were not happy, and someone said, well, you must have got it about right. Well, I'm not sure that we did, but certainly there was a lot of personal attack, and I imagine there's probably still a lot of personal attack for departmental staff. And I think that it's important to note that there's been this rush of, well, I think it's a rush, since the 80s of environmental protection and changes to legislation. People flagged that this was particularly an act about agricultural land and controlling agricultural clearing, which continued despite the fact that more than 90% of the South West Land Division had been cleared. So it was still continuing in the 90s. But it was also a way of actually looking at clearing in other landscapes as well. And there is some massive clearing that goes on that's mining as well. So it wasn't just about controlling agriculture, but 2014 Shire Esperance actually proposed 500,000 hectares of clearing for agricultural purposes. So there are still processes which make this legislation, controversial as it was, and holes and weaknesses that it has, certainly worthwhile. Thank you.
Questions?
This is known as the graveyard shift after lunch.